It ended in 12 seconds, not with raised voices, not with correction or argument. A Commando commander questioned whether what he was seeing belonged in a military setting. Witnesses would later say the response was brief, controlled, and impossible to dismiss. There was no confrontation, no visible force, no attempt to impress. Yet when it was over, the room had changed. So had the commander. What happened was not explained that day. It did not need to be. The result spoke quietly, and it stayed. The field was arranged with precision. Rows were marked, distances measured. The day's schedule had already been accounted for before the first boot touched the ground. Soldiers stood in formation, equipment aligned, posture uniform. This was a space governed by order, where movement followed command and authority was clearly defined. BruceLee did not belong to this system, at least not on paper. He stood slightly apart from the formation, dressed simply, without insignia or rank. No uniform distinguished him from the ground beneath his feet. Yet he was not out of place. He moved with familiarity, as though the structure around him did not constrain him but clarified him. The soldiers watched closely. Some had heard his name before arriving. Others knew only that a civilian instructor had been brought in to demonstrate something outside standard doctrine. There was curiosity, but also skepticism. Military training left little room for interpretation. Effectiveness was measured, tested, repeated. Anything unnecessary was removed. BruceLee began without announcement. He did not address the formation formally. He did not ask for attention. He simply demonstrated movements, short, efficient, economical. No flourish, no emphasis. His actions were functional, stripped of display. Each motion ended where it needed to, without excess. The soldiers followed with their eyes rather than their bodies. They were trained to observe detail. What they noticed first was not speed, but restraint. Nothing was wasted. Each movement appeared to conserve energy rather than expend it. The environment mattered. This was not a dojo. There were no rituals, no symbolic gestures. The ground was uneven. The air carried dust and heat, conditions that rewarded practicality over style. BruceLee adjusted without comment, his movements remaining intact despite the change in surface and space. A few officers exchanged glances. The system they represented valued repetition and control. Yet what they were seeing did not resist those values. It aligned with them in unfamiliar ways. The movements were not foreign. They were simply arranged differently, as if answering the same questions with fewer steps. Still, the hierarchy remained intact. At the edge of the formation stood the Commando commander. He observed without interruption, arms folded, expression neutral. His authority did not need reinforcement. It was assumed. He had seen demonstrations before, many of them. Most failed to translate beyond controlled environments. BruceLee continued, unhurried. He did not ask the soldiers to participate yet. He showed them what was possible before asking anything of them. The lesson was not verbal, it was structural. How the body organized itself under pressure. How balance preceded power. How efficiency replaced force. The soldiers stood quietly, absorbing. Nothing had been challenged yet. No lines crossed, but the ground had been prepared, not through argument, not through persuasion, but through clarity. The commander watched a moment longer. Then he spoke, and the nature of the day shifted. The commander did not raise his voice. He spoke as someone accustomed to being heard without effort. His tone was measured, professional, absent of hostility. He did not interrupt the demonstration mid-movement. He waited until BruceLee came to a natural pause, then addressed him in full view of the formation. "This is not military," he said. The words were not an insult. They were a classification. In his world, that distinction mattered. Military training was built on repeatable systems, clear chains of command, and methods that could be standardized across hundreds, sometimes thousands of men. Anything else was, at best, supplemental. The soldiers remained still. No one looked away. This was no longer a demonstration. It was a question of relevance. BruceLee turned toward the commander calmly. There was no defensiveness in his posture, no attempt to assert legitimacy. He did not reference credentials or experience. He did not argue that his methods had been used elsewhere. He listened. Witnesses later recalled that this moment felt heavier than the challenge itself. Rank carried weight here. To question a commander publicly was unthinkable. To ignore him would be unacceptable. The system demanded response. BruceLee did not rush to provide one. The commander continued, clarifying his position. He spoke of practicality, of battlefield conditions, of the need for techniques that could be taught quickly and executed under extreme stress. His concern was not theoretical. It was operational. Around them, the soldiers stood attentive. Many had already begun evaluating what they had seen through that same lens. Would this work under fatigue? Under pressure? In chaos? BruceLee nodded once. "I understand," he said. That was all. The brevity unsettled some in the ranks. They expected defense, explanation, persuasion. Instead, BruceLee's response seemed to remove the argument entirely. He did not claim compatibility. He did not deny the difference. He accepted the premise without conceding the outcome. The commander studied him more closely now. Civilian instructors often reacted poorly to scrutiny. They leaned on reputation or resisted comparison. BruceLee did neither. His composure did not signal submission. It signaled readiness. "Then show me," the commander said. The request was direct. No theatrics, no provocation. It was an invitation framed as evaluation, the kind that left little room for ambiguity. BruceLee looked toward the formation briefly. Not to seek approval, not to select a participant, just to acknowledge the presence of witnesses. What followed would not be private. It would be observed, remembered, and judged. He stepped forward slightly, aligning himself with the commander's position. The distance between them closed by a small margin. Not enough to suggest confrontation, but enough to suggest intention. The authority in the space had not yet shifted, but it had been engaged. And everyone present understood that whatever happened next would not be explained afterward. It would either hold under observation, or it would not. No command was given. The formation remained intact, soldiers standing at ease yet fully alert. Their training had conditioned them to recognize moments when action might be required without being instructed. This was one of those moments. Attention sharpened, not outwardly, but internally. Breathing slowed. Weight settled evenly through boots into the ground. The commander did not move closer. He did not step back either. His authority held its place through stillness. He watched BruceLee with the same scrutiny he applied to any unfamiliar variable. Careful, detached, precise. BruceLee mirrored that restraint. He did not prepare theatrically. No stance was assumed that suggested combat. His hands remained open, relaxed at his sides, shoulders loose, spine aligned. He appeared less like someone about to demonstrate and more like someone waiting for conditions to become clear. The silence lengthened. It was not uncomfortable. It was evaluative. In military environments, tension often builds through anticipation rather than confrontation. The absence of motion becomes its own signal. The soldiers recognized this instinctively. Many would later say this was the moment that felt most significant. Not what followed, but the restraint that preceded it. The commander spoke again, briefly, indicating a simple scenario. No elaborate setup, no artificial constraints. He wanted to see whether the movements translated when stripped of context and ceremony. BruceLee acknowledged with a slight inclination of his head. He adjusted his position by inches, not steps. His feet aligned with the ground, accounting for its unevenness. His body did not square aggressively. It remained neutral, adaptable. Observers noted how little space he required, how compact his structure appeared compared to the commander's broader frame. Still, nothing happened. This delay was not hesitation. It was calibration. BruceLee waited, not for permission, but for alignment. Timing mattered more than immediacy. The commander, accustomed to decisive action, allowed it. He sensed that whatever was coming would not be rushed. The soldiers felt it now. A collective awareness settled over the field. This was no longer about whether something would occur, but about how little would be needed for it to occur. The tension was not loud. It did not escalate. It simply focused. Then, without signal or warning, the moment resolved. There was no visible escalation to mark it. No audible cue. Just a brief convergence of movement and stillness that most struggled to describe afterward. BruceLee moved. And in that movement, measured, restrained, precise, the question the commander had raised began to answer itself. The field remained silent. But the balance within it had already begun to shift. Those closest to the moment would later disagree on what they saw. Some said BruceLee barely moved. Others insisted there was motion, but too small to isolate. Something that happened between breaths, between attention and recognition. No one described it as forceful. No one described it as aggressive. The language people reached for was imprecise, because the event itself resisted emphasis. What was certain was the effect. The commander did not fall. He did not stumble. There was no outward sign that anything had gone wrong. For a brief instant, he appeared exactly as he had been moments earlier, upright, composed, in command of his body. Then his structure shifted. It was subtle, a redistribution of weight, a pause where there should have been continuity. His breath caught, not sharply, but enough to register. The kind of interruption that occurs when expectation fails to align with reality. BruceLee had already disengaged. He stood where he had been before, posture unchanged, attention neutral. There was no follow-up, no completion movement, no attempt to reinforce what had just occurred. Whatever he had done required no confirmation. The commander's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. He assessed his own position first, then the space around him. His training demanded that he identify variables immediately. He found none that fit his experience. He took a step, testing his balance. It returned, but slower than expected. His body responded, but not with its usual certainty. There was no pain to report, no injury to attribute the sensation to, only a brief, undeniable disruption. The soldiers noticed. Not the movement, most of them had missed that, but the pause that followed. In military environments, pauses are rare. They are noticed. The commander's silence carried weight. He did not speak. He did not issue instruction. He simply stood, recalibrating. BruceLee waited. He did not explain what had happened. He did not name the method or contextualize it for the formation. The demonstration had been sufficient. Any explanation would have shifted attention away from the experience itself. Finally, the commander looked at him again, not challengingly, not dismissively, with interest. "That will do," he said. The words were not concession. They were acknowledgement. The evaluation had reached a conclusion without needing to be articulated. The question of whether the movement belonged in a military setting no longer required debate. The field remained quiet. No one spoke. No one broke formation. The soldiers absorbed the moment without commentary, as they had been trained to do. They understood that what they had witnessed was not meant to impress. It was meant to function. BruceLee stepped back to his original position. The distance between him and the commander returned to what it had been before, though the meaning of that distance had changed. Authority had not been challenged openly. It had been clarified. The demonstration ended as it began, without ceremony. What lingered was not the action itself, but the realization that effectiveness did not need volume, and control did not require force. The question had been answered. What followed would take longer to settle. The commander remained silent longer than protocol required. In a field where instructions were expected to follow demonstrations, the absence of commentary was conspicuous. Soldiers did not shift. They did not relax. They waited, understanding that silence itself was now part of the evaluation. The commander's posture was unchanged, but his attention had turned inward. He replayed the moment not as an observer, but as a participant. There had been no warning, no cue to respond to. His body had reacted before his analysis could catch up, and that unsettled him more than force ever could. He looked down briefly, then back up at BruceLee. "What you showed," he said, choosing his words carefully, "was not a technique. It was not a question." BruceLee did not correct him. He did not affirm the statement either. He waited. The commander continued, speaking now for the benefit of the formation as much as himself. He spoke of efficiency, though not as doctrine. He spoke of control, though not as dominance. He framed the experience in operational terms, trying to locate it within systems he understood. There was no easy placement. The realization came gradually, visible in the way his tone softened. What he had encountered was not incompatible with military training. It existed beneath it. It addressed the same objectives with fewer assumptions. It did not require conditioning toward a specific form. It required awareness. The commander dismissed the formation for a brief break. The soldiers dispersed quietly, not speaking among themselves. Many replayed the moment internally, trying to reconcile what they had seen with what they had been taught. Some felt unsettled. Others felt clarified. BruceLee remained where he was. The commander approached him, no longer as an evaluator, but as a peer seeking understanding. There was no apology offered. None was necessary. Instead, there was acknowledgement, a recognition that the demonstration had revealed a gap not in training, but in perspective. They spoke briefly, privately. Observers could not hear the words, but they noticed the shift in posture between them. Less distance. Less rigidity. Mutual attention. When the soldiers returned, the structure of the session changed. BruceLee was not asked to repeat what he had done. Instead, he was asked to guide awareness. How to move without committing too early. How to remain balanced under uncertainty. How to respond without excess. These were not framed as techniques, but as conditions to be met. The commander observed closely. He did not intervene. He did not reinterpret. He allowed the lesson to exist as it was, subtle, difficult to define, but undeniably functional. His earlier certainty had not collapsed dramatically. It had adjusted. That adjustment would matter. Not immediately, not visibly. But from that point forward, The commander watched differently, and the soldiers, sensing the shift, followed his lead. The demonstration had ended. The lesson had not. The field returned to order. Commands resumed. Timetables were adjusted. Training continued. On the surface, nothing had changed. The soldiers ran drills, repeated movements, followed instructions as they always had. Yet those who were present that day carried something subtle with them, something that did not announce itself, but surfaced quietly over time. In later sessions, instructors noticed small differences. Soldiers began conserving movement without being told. They corrected balance instinctively. Under pressure drills, some stopped overcommitting. They recovered faster, not because they were stronger, but because they were calmer. These changes were not attributed to a lesson or a method. No one referenced BruceLee directly. There was no doctrine added, no manual revised. The shift lived beneath language. The commander, too, was altered, not in rank, not in authority, but in perception. In evaluations, he paid closer attention to how soldiers responded, rather than how forcefully they acted. He questioned excess. He allowed silence to work before issuing correction. When instructors asked why, he did not explain. He simply said, "Efficiency lasts." Years later, the story surfaced in fragments, not in official records, not in speeches. It emerged in quiet conversations between veterans, usually when discussions turned toward effectiveness rather than heroics. The details varied. The time was remembered differently, but the core remained consistent. A civilian instructor, a brief moment, and a realization that could not be dismissed. BruceLee never followed up. He did not return to claim influence or recognition. His role in the moment ended when alignment was achieved. Whatever remained was not his to manage. That restraint, intentional and complete, became part of the lesson itself. Some soldiers carried that day into leadership roles. Others left the service entirely. But many would later describe moments when restraint mattered more than action, when timing mattered more than force. In those moments, they did not recall techniques. They recalled stillness. The incident became something quieter than legend. It was not told to inspire. It was not told to impress. It was told as a reminder that control does not need visibility, and mastery does not require declaration. 12 seconds had been enough, not to prove superiority, not to overturn systems, but to adjust understanding. And that adjustment endured, long after the field had emptied, long after the demonstration had faded into memory, leaving behind a silence that continued to teach.